Share. All right, can you see this okay? Are you able to see?
Yeah, Sean, we can see your slide.
Okay, good. Okay, I'll get started then. So yes, the name of this talk is called Everything is a Plugin, Mastering Webpack from the Inside Out. And so, let me, since I can't see the audience quite right now, let me just hear like a shout for those who use Webpack again. Like, that's great. Good, good. Okay, but now I want to hear a shout out for those who understand how it works. Okay. But that's the goal here. That's what the goal that I want to walk away with for you today, right? So my name is Sean Larkin. I'm a technical program manager for Microsoft. I work on Edge Dev tools, but you may know me as one of the maintainers, and I kind of fit the role of advocate for the Webpack open source project. I also spent some time working on the Angular CLI and bringing Webpack to the Angular ecosystem. And now I'm just kind of like a general open source, evangelist, continuing to try and support that. A little bit about myself before we dive in is that I'm a former tech support rep gone rogue. I got tired of, just answering phone calls and working around issues. And instead I wanted to be able to help solve the problem instead of just work around it. So I started learning AppleScript, and then I learned Ruby and Objective-C, and then finally it moved on to JavaScript. So if you want to find me anywhere, you can find me at the Larkin. And if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see me doing a good shaku as well. Ask Sani Yusuf. I do. I do a good one. So just ask them. But yes, you can follow me there on any of those links. And if you wanted to tweet this right now, I'm not, go ahead. I'm not going to mind. Everything is a Webpack plugin. Your life will be changed. So now, if you don't get a chance to ask me a question, you can always find me or ask me on my GitHub under the repo AMA. So github.com/thelarkin/AMA. And it doesn't matter. It can be about life, money, whatever, personal. And then I like to give a shout out to all of our sponsors and backers that help make this project possible. And especially Trivago, who has decided to sponsor us again for an entire year of $120,000 for the entire year. So why don't we give a round of applause to all the people that are, that you see here and the companies that are involved. Without them, we wouldn't be possible. All right, so let's dive into this. Everything is a plugin. So, I have 3 goals that I want you to walk away with. And this isn't the lightest talk. This is going to have some heavy content, and we're going to dive deep into Webpack, right? Because we use it every day, but we don't understand how it works. And so we're going to do things like walk a little bit of the source code. We're going to look at the anatomy of a Webpack plugin. And then finally, you're going to achieve ultimate power. Also, like, my ulterior motive is that we want you to contribute to our project. And so using it is just the first step. But if you understand how it works, you can make so much more of an impact, not only in your own workflow, but even for the 15 other million monthly downloads that use Webpack every month. So before we even talk about kind of the plugin system and Webpack, the first thing we're going to talk about is this class, this library, and we call it tappable. So it's not like the most, it's kind of a weird word to say, tappable, but it's actually it started out as a 200-line plugin library. And this library is the backbone of Webpack. All of Webpack is an entire event-driven system. And if you look into our source code, you'll see that everything else, besides maybe about 6 or 10 classes, are all plugins, the entire code base. And so how do we use Tappable in the Webpack source code itself? And so you can see here that what we're doing is we take and, oh, I can annotate. This is an example of one of the Webpack classes called compiler.js. And what happens is that when you use this library, you extend the existing class here called compiler. So we just say compiler extends Tappable. But what this gives us now is all these methods that this class can call to emit events, right? So this is very similar to event emitter in Node.js if you've ever used it. And each of these are special event strings that plugins can listen to access new functionality. So if we go to the next slide here, we can see that, I'll fix the annotation. You can actually take and use this to actually plug into those events that are being used. So here's an example of a Webpack plugin itself. All a Webpack plugin is a class that has an apply method. And so what happens is that Webpack will call this apply method from this plugin, and it passes that compiler in. And the API here is that we're just listening to those individual events that you saw that were being defined on the other screen. So if we keep going, we updated this plugin library as a Webpack 4 and completely rebuilt it from the ground up. So instead of having these arbitrary strings, now we actually have what we call hooks that live on the class themselves. So you can see here, here's a hook that's being called, and here's some data that's being passed in through the event. And then an example of another plugin that's in our Webpack source code. What this does is you can see it's plugging into those individual events here and listening to them until they're actually called. So, I mean, if we break it down, we have a class that extends Tappable and it's emitting an event, some sort of, like Webpack's running or Webpack's stopping or failing or building. And then you have plugins that are listening to those individual events and responding to them with changes. So when I say, what is a tappable instance? You guys might, I'm going to say this a whole bunch. So a tappable instance is a class or an object that just extends Tappable. But then when you think it from a practical level, it's just something you can plug into, right? Or you could write a plugin for. And it's more than just, you can tap into one instance to access another one. And so you see in this diagram here, you have to tap into the compiler to even access the compilation. And I'll talk about what each of these, compilation and compiler, some of these terms to me when I saw them for the first time made no sense to me. And so we're going to break them down. So the point of this talk is that I'm going to walk you through the 7-ish tappable instances that are in Webpack that you should understand. So the first one is the compiler. So the compiler itself is like this top level, I call it central dispatch, right? Because it is responsible for starting and stopping. It catches failures, success messages, and it's responsible for all the top level operations of Webpack, right? And it's also the Node API. So if you've ever used the Node API when you're using Webpack, that's the same, that is the compiler instance. And the next tappable instance that we're going to talk about is probably one of the most important. It's the compilation. So a compilation is just something that a compiler creates. That's what the word is representing. But what you can think about is anything that the compilation does has to do with your dependency graph. So it's kind of like the brain of all of Webpack. It's created by the compiler. And it contains all of the code responsible for creating and optimizing your entire graph of your project. The next instance is called the resolver. So I don't like the term resolver because it seems, it doesn't make sense to me personally, but what does a resolver do? It's responsible for finding things. So in this case, let's take a partial path to a module, such as like your entry point. Well, what the resolver does is it receives this partial path and it says, I'm going to go find this. I'm going to make sure it actually exists. And when it does, it's going to return that absolute path and a whole bunch more rich information that is tied to it. And what's super cool is like, just like any of these other instances, the resolver is also is pluggable, right? So you can plug into it. So much so that we have it in a separate library called Enhanced Resolve, and you can see everything. There's already tons of plugins that we've created out of the box to abstract functionality for you. So the next instance is called the module factory. So if you've ever used like Angular or written Java, I don't know if maybe they do this in PHP, but if you've heard of the term factory, you know that it is something that creates a instance, right? Like it returns an object type. And so when we say module factory, all it's doing is creating a module or a module representation in your code. So what does the module factory do? It takes a successfully resolved request from the resolver, and now that we know that that file exists in your code, the module factory collects that source and actually creates an object from it. So if we diagrammed this, what would this look like? So you can see here we've taken this beautiful information that the resolver has returned for us. We pass it through the module factory, and out comes this awesome object instance that is a module, right? It is the in-code representation of your JavaScript module that you've written. So beautiful. So the next instance is called the parser. So if you've ever written a parser before or know what a parser is, it is a kind of a compiler or tool that allows you to easily read a source code string and build it into an AST. So I even like breaking out of my slides just to show this example. So if you go to astexplorer.net, this is a perfect example, right? So if you look at this code right here, this website is just running different parsers and returning their object formats. Let me make this a little bit bigger for you. So you can see here, if I click on one piece of the source code, it actually highlights in this AST what is represented here. So the point of a parser is to take a source string and build out this nice, easy to walk and traverse object or JSON. So in the same way, the webpack parser, all it does is it parses your JavaScript module and creates an AST for it. And on top of that, though, it walks that AST and it's looking for what we call dependency statements. So what would a dependency statement look like? So if I rewrote this code in AST Explorer and I said import, foo from foo, right? We use modules all the time in this syntax. Well, if a parser read this, you can see that it has a specific type and a specific token, and even has the information for the name. So when a parser parses this, we're looking for this import declaration, right? Because we know that it expresses that a file depends on another. So the parser is going to take that module that we've created, it parses it looking for requires and imports, and then it attaches these little instances called dependencies, right? So for every import you have in a file, you're going to have a dependency on another file. And then finally, probably the last but not least is the template. I mean, we all know what templates are. We use them every day in our UI code. Even if you use JSX, that's technically a template. It's a templating language or a DSL. And so it allows you to take data and bind it to whatever view that you're trying to create. In the same way, a template for Webpack or the template instance is responsible for taking your dependency graph data and binding it into strings that will actually create your bundle, right? So it creates the code that you see when you run Webpack. And each kind of data type inside of Webpack, so we have chunks which hold modules and modules which have dependencies. Each dependency has its own flavor and specific type. Each of these has their own template, right? And so what happens is that this data is rendered based on its template. And then what is returned is something that actually looks like, if you've ever looked at the Webpack bundle, that's the code that you see that's created. And so each part of that Webpack bundle is specifically created from one template or another. So if we think about it now, I'm gonna break down each of those instances that we just talked about. But what I did is I did them in order in how Webpack works. So let's say you have an entry point, right? And it's just a JavaScript file. Well, so the compiler is going to pass this information into and create a new compilation. Well, what happens is that that entry needs to be resolved because we don't know if that file exists yet. So that will it will go from your configuration and go through the module factory, and we're going to say, hey, resolver, can you make sure that this module exists, right? And so once it finds out that it exists, it can now create a module object out of it. So we now have a module object that we can send to be parsed and look for dependencies, right? So now what happens is that we take and we send, we have a parser that parses the string for this module, and for every dependency statement, it attaches, that reference onto it. But if we look back at our example in AST Explorer, you'll notice that we need to determine whether or not this is actually a path that is resolved. So for every single, for every dependency, we have to repeat this exact same process over again. So we just recurse until our graph is built out and has no more dependencies. So now that might be a little overwhelming to kind of go through at first, right? So I wrote this little comic strip, but this is how Webpack builds the graph, right? I could even draw it here. That's my favorite part. So let's say I have a foo.js. And what's going to happen is that we need to resolve it, right? We can't accept this partial path. So once we resolve it, we're going to collect the source, and then we create this object here. That's our node in our graph. And then as we parse it, we're going to look for other dependency statements. And if we find them, we're going to attach them to the module or the node itself, right? We call these edges in the graph. Well, now we have unresolved paths, and so we have to repeat that exact same process again. So we create another node, and then we create another node. And then for this file, we collect the source and repeat until we have an entire graph that's been created. It may sound a little redundant, but I like driving this message home because this is the first main step of Webpack, which is build the graph. So now we actually still have to bundle it and create those files. So you'll see here I have this comic, and we're going to go through it, right? So how does this graph turn into something that we see in our bundled code? So, hey, I'm a module. I can't wait to work in the browser. And you can see this is our module instance from our graph. The compilation's like, whoa there, cool your jets. We need to get you into shape before you're ready for the big stage. First, you need to jump into this container called a chunk, and we're going to be optimizing you a bunch, and we don't want to lose track of you. And we're almost there, but we have a problem. Those require and import statements in your code have to go. They technically don't work in the browser. So the parser gave me instructions on how to replace it with code that does work, called dependency templates. And then finally, oh my gosh, I'm finally rendered. Look, I'm ready. Here we go, browser land. And entirely under the hood, you just understood how Webpack works. Create the graph, optimize it, and then render it with templates. So that is Webpack in its entirety. And you might be like, Sean, why should I care? I'm just trying to build some apps, man. Like, let me just build some apps. But at the end of the day, I found out that not only did I appreciate Webpack more, but since everything is a plugin, that means that any piece of Webpack that we just talked about today can be extended, changed, overridden, or modified to fit any need that you have. Webpack's true value is that it's completely extensible. And so I created a little workspace that if you ever wanted to jump into it, lessons for kind of this talk that teach you how to create different types of plugins. So you can go to my GitHub and search the Larkin/everything is a plugin. But if you have questions or where do I start from here? We have lots of cool resources. One of my favorite ones is going to our contributor guide. Actually, I'm just going to pull it up because it's easier to get to. /contributor guide. Contributors guide. So I basically talk about this entire process and outline it so that if you want to get involved or writing your own plugins or contributing back to Webpack, you can take a look at them and go through each of the processes. So, but otherwise, feel free. You can always reach out to me on Twitter and ask me anything about plugins. My DMs are open and they're super packed, and so I'm happy to help you with anything, especially if you're making something like a Webpack plugin or dealing with parsers. So, are there any questions?
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah.
Questions? Okay.
Hi, Sean.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So thank you for the presentation, and I would say this has been the best one so far for me.
Thank you.
Then, can you hear me, Sean?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yes. Can you hear me?
All right. So, well, first I want to say, having followed along the presentation, it doesn't seem so overwhelming after all, Webpack. And so are the slides going to be available for this talk?
Absolutely. Yes. I'll give them to Christian or Prosper, and they can post them. I have them public as well, I believe.
Okay. Then where do loaders fit in the 7-ish parts of Webpack?
Where does what?
Loaders.
That is a great question, actually. So I feel like I should just show you in the source code, right? Or you know what? There's a diagram that I'll just jump back to. So I'm resuming the share here. So one of the things I kind of glossed over, right? And I'm really glad that you asked. I didn't want to confuse too many people because sometimes it can be confusing. This specific. So if you look here in this graph that I'm showing, so if the file that you're trying to load matches up against a rule that you've defined in your config for a loader, what happens is that we're going to functionally transform that first. So at the end of the day, everything, anything that's not JavaScript has to be transformed to the loader so that the parser can actually parse it as JavaScript. And so what happens is that if there are rules that match against it, it's going to go through the loader runner and apply those functions, and then it passes it back to the parser. So it's actually part of building the graph one by one. As you create a module, it's going to go through and say like, hey, let's collect the source. And is there something in the config like a regular expression or the test property? Does that match against this extension? If it does, let's go ahead and transform it and then return it back to the parser. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
And hi, Sean.
Hey.
Christian, you mentioned sometime in the past that we can get contributors here for Webpack. I don't know if you can talk about it briefly for like a minute or how we can go about it.
Like how you contribute in itself,
Yeah,
or
yeah, contribute to both the ecosystem generally, not just the main code base.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, like there are so many different ways that you can contribute. I kind of talk about this in our contributors guide in like the first, uh, like this first post here talks about what we call the ecosystem overview, right? So like we have we have 100 repos across 2 GitHub orgs. And so if you wanted to dive into code itself and find something that interests you, there's all of these options here that are available. But on top of that, there's all sorts of other ways. And like we try to make it very like front and center in our contributing section. Let's see, where is it contributing? Or wait, it's on in our README here. Come on now, there we go. So if you can see here, like we try and break it down, like there's more than just code, right? Like it's beyond pull requests and commits. So some of the things that are like helping us triage issues, simple things like spelling and grammar, searching, like things that I do is like searching Webpack on Twitter, and I still do this day, is literally just helping people who are having issues with Webpack, right? Or even blogging, speaking about it at conferences, creating tutorials, you know, and so I'd say take a look at this list, because this is going to be like this. We try to encompass, you know, like what contributing to our ecosystem and our project is about. And on top of that, like if you wanted to run local events, you know, I remember working with you and Prosper, and even seeing if Ide wanted to get involved in, you know, our initiative Webpack Africa, so that you can have local communities to find people who are passionate about Webpack, and build up their experience, right? And so that they could do conference talks and we could review them, and help them find places that they could get speak at. So hopefully that answers your question. I rambled a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Dawes. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for all that you do for Webpack.
Oh, thank you, guys. We would be nothing without our community. So, you know, every day, like we are thankful that people use it and depend on it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.